How do you begin to talk about Gerald Murnane? There's a bit of a legend that's emerged around the man. One profile in the New Yorker described him as the reclusive giant of Australian letters, but that's not quite right. He's not a recluse exactly. He's just doing his own thing. He lives in a small town in the Western District of Victoria called Goroke, with a population of about 300. And by all accounts, Gerald is a sociable, well-liked member of the community. He's the long-standing secretary of the local golf club, hardly a hermit. When the New York Times published a profile, they called it, "Is the next Nobel laureate in literature tending bar in a dusty Australian town?" To which the answers are, maybe yes, but also he only tends bar on special occasions. But you get the picture. Next Nobel laureate, giant of Australian letters. These are the kind of terms in which Gerald Murnane gets discussed. Another one that gets thrown around is strange but brilliant. He doesn't have readers, he has acolytes. People around the world who read him and then devote their lives to writing about him and reading him again and trying to persuade other people to read him. He's this massive figure in the literary landscape, but also an elusive one. Not always easy to read and even less easy to describe. The first Gerald Murnane book I read was The Plains, which is the novel for which he's arguably best known. I loved it, I've reread it, and yet I still struggle to describe what it's actually about. The best I can come up with is, it's a book that's about itself, but that makes it seem like some kind of meta wank, and completely fails to capture the delicacy and the gentle, probing beauty of the book. He's written 10 novels, collections of short stories, essays, a memoir about horse racing called Something for the Pain, and all of this represents one of the most formidable, powerful, singular bodies of work in literature. So I decided I need to go and visit him, and go and see how Gerald Murnane talks about Gerald Murnane.
Once upon a time there was a boy called Gerald Murnane.
Once upon a time, there was a show called Read This, about the books we love, the stories behind them, and this week, Gerald Murnane. I drove out to meet Gerald a couple of months back, 4 days before his 85th birthday. His longtime friend and publisher Ivor Indick helped me make the arrangement. No emails, just text messages. And Gerald is warm and direct, immediately agreeable, and swift to make arrangements. We're to meet at the golf club. On first approach, I completely missed the dirt track up to the clubhouse. Google Maps has given up the ghost, and it's just me and the scrub and a quickly disappearing gap in the trees before I find myself lost on some random back road between the paddocks. I circle back, retrace my steps, and there it is. A squat fibro building nestled in the trees, lazy cockies strolling around an overgrown garden. It's not exactly clear where the golf course itself is, but Gerald is there, unmistakable, ready to talk.
Now, it's going to take me 10 minutes to eat a sandwich and have a drink of coffee. So you're not in a tearing hurry?
I'm in no tearing hurry whatsoever. I'm going to have a drink of water. The room is quiet. He's worrying about the hum of the fridge as I set up my recording equipment. He's already laid out all his books in various editions on one of the tables and has clearly put a lot of thought into which chairs are best for us to sit in. And the chat flows immediately. For about 20 minutes as he eats and I set up, we talk about family and places we've both lived. He's funny, and this disarming mix of very considered and deliberate on the one hand, and idiosyncratic and completely free range on the other. I keep looking at the spread of books on the tabletop, the beautiful abstract covers and titles like Invisible Yet Enduring Lilacs and A Million Windows. Tamarisk Row is there. It's 50 years since it was first published, and I still remember the little boy at the heart of it, Clement Killiaton, sitting on a mat and building an imaginary life, pushing marbles around, through which he builds an entire reality. I want to ask Gerald about that boy, about those marbles and stained glass and horse racing, and about perfect sentences. But when the microphones are on and we start talking, it's his late wife Catherine who comes to the foreground first. It was in 2009, following her death, that Gerald moved to Goroke, and it's clear that she remains a significant ongoing presence, not just in his daily consciousness, but in how he regards the world of writing and the mind.
We had an extraordinary relationship as author and wife, never mind all the rest of our marriage, which was a turbulent marriage, not always by any means a happy marriage, but a successful one to judge from the ending of it. All ended well. She seldom asked me about my books. I don't even remember asking her had she read the books. I know she did read them, but she had this strange, well, I don't know really what she had. I suspect that she was puzzled and intrigued to read what I'd written because it was not often what I talked about. We were very close. We had no hesitation in talking about the most difficult matters or controversial things. People say the three most difficult things to talk about on a deep level are sex, the afterlife and money. We managed to talk about those with a few differences, but we didn't ever, or very seldom, talked about my books. Sometimes I would read to her just a paragraph and she would make a comment, but not often. And then when I stopped writing for publication, I've never stopped writing, when I stopped writing for publication after the publication of Emerald Blue in 1995, and I didn't tell her straight away, and when she found out that I wasn't writing anything for publication, I was very much affected by the disappointment she displayed. And I thought, well, my writing must mean more to you than you've ever told me and I've ever suspected. And then, after a year or two, she began to, well, in common parlance, niggle at me and say, when are you going to start writing again? And when I didn't show any evidence that I was starting writing again, then she went into a different mode and started to say, it's a tragic, well, yes, she might have used that word, it's a very tragic thing that you haven't got the recognition that you've got for your books. And that's all she said. I'd had 7 books published up till then, and of course the planes have made me almost famous for a few years, but it wasn't enough for her and she regretted it. And then she lived to see, she just lived to see me finishing Barley Patch, and I wouldn't have been so bold as to say this outright in earlier years, but at my age you can say anything and get away with it. I have an unquenchable, absolutely, utterly confident belief that we live on as parts of us survive death. And it's just spooky to me to see that she'd only been dead a few months and I won the Melbourne Prize, and then all the rest has happened in the last few years. I don't say any more than that. It's maybe just a wonderful coincidence. The strange thing is that what I won't say I yearned for it, but what I felt with a sense of grievance that I deserved but didn't have in all those years, I now have, and I don't really take the trouble to appreciate it. I play golf at Goroke and play my racing, add to my racing archives and stuff. I hear the sounds of distant thunder and the applause of distant crowds and things. And like the poor guy dying at the end of Jude the Obscure, there's a festival in the street or something and he's dying upstairs. And it's not quite like that, but yes, I've got it all that I won't say yearned for, I'll say felt that I deserved. I could have done without, I could have survived without it, but it would have been a tough life. And now, if I want to, just suppose I was feeling a bit miserable one night, I just go Google Gerald Murnane.
Yeah.
A bloke was playing golf with me at a tournament at Edenhope. A bloke had come up from somewhere in the Western District and he said, oh, you're from Goroke. We just finished playing, shook hands. He said, you're from Goroke. He said, there's some sort of famous painter or somebody lives at Goroke, isn't there? And I said, oh, I think so. And I got out my phone and I said, would this be him? He said, I've been playing golf with you. I didn't. And people do. I mean, it's not a welcome thing because the storekeeper and the post office lady and the people in the town know not to direct people to my house. Tell them to put a note in the post office, and if I want to answer them, I'll answer them. It's happened occasionally.
There's not many writers to whom readers would do a pilgrimage. Like, in terms of a marker of...
I think I think that I'm not saying this from a sense of mock modesty, but I think that the oddness of Goroke as a name and as a locality that's nearly 400 k's from Melbourne, I think if I lived at South Geelong, there might be so many pilgrims.
By my count, and I may have this wrong, so please correct me, but by my count, you have 4 times, I think, declared that a book that you're bringing out is going to be your last book.
That wasn't any sort of pose. I actually have a couple of times in the last year or so, I thought I've never thought I could make something into a book, but I was coaching, writing letters of help to a young writer, and I said, here is the beginning of what could be a long piece of short fiction. And I wrote the beginning, and I thought for a couple of days, I thought, I could go on with that. And then a tiredness overcame me. I thought, but I tell you that because my stating that I won't write again has been always an honest thing. And then out of the blue comes a possibility and a few words with it, a mental image, a few scenes, and I get started, or I have got started in the past. The very last book was written, the explanation is simple. I was writing these essays for the archive, and not writing them with elaborate care, just writing them as you'd write a diary entry. And then I was writing about my own books, what they meant to me at my advanced age. And I let my publisher know of this, and he urged me and succeeded in persuading me to write them for publication. So that's one example of how a book came about that I never intended to write. But the others genuinely came. See, when I came to Goroke, I didn't think I'd write anymore. I'd finished Barley Patch and a history of books. And I don't often take notice of dreams, but I dreamed about coloured glass. And I noticed a church, a little old Wesleyan church around the corner from the house where I'm living, my son's house. And I looked at the coloured glass, and I realised that coloured glass was a strange thing. To understand what coloured glass, the true appearance of coloured glass, you didn't stand outside in the light, you stood inside in the darkness. I couldn't see what these windows represented in the church because I was out in the bright sunlight, and to understand I had to go into the dark, the gloomy church, which I eventually did and saw what they were. And just that mystery of vision and appearances fascinate me. So the book Border Districts came from there, although, as I said, I'd announced to people, no, I've given up writing for publication. The same with A Million Windows. Once upon a time, I got a lot of my just background knowledge from reading good old Time, not Time Australia, Time International, way back in the 60s and 70s. And I also used to admire when I went to films, which I've stopped doing a long time ago, I used to admire some of the films or scenes in the films of Ingmar Bergman. And I was looking through some old Time magazines from about the 80s, and I noticed that in his last years, Bergman decided to make a film. I don't know if he ever succeeded, and it was to be set in a castle, and in every room of the castle was one of the characters from one of his other films. And I thought, straight away, it just came to me that I could write a book about a house, and I thought of Henry James's words, the house of fiction has a million windows. All the books that I've admired, or the writers that I've admired, are all living in this castle, and I'm there among them, nameless and anonymous, and we're all writing, and we have a few drinks together at night and talk about our writing methods and such things. And out of those daydreams almost came the book A Million Windows. So once again, a chance happening, something catches my eye, takes my notice, or I should speak in the past tense, something took my eye, and a statement that I'd made to the effect that no more books would emerge from me had to be negated.
I mean, as a reader, I'm grateful that something else took your fancy afterwards each time, but I'm curious about even the physical impulse to say, I think I'm done. Is it fatigue? Is it just a preparedness to apply your brain somewhere else?
It would have to be some element of tiredness in it, but also See, I think a lot about infinity, and I mentioned before about my reluctance to use terms like intellect, feeling, memory, imagination. But the mind, now, some people say there's a superego and an id and an unconscious. I have never found any evidence for that view of the mind. My view of the mind is rather like the view that I can see around me all day in the Western Wimmera. Mostly level landscape with a line of trees in the distance. I think that's what my mind really is. I know, to some it would seem a childish thing, too bad. And the next question is, what's behind the line of trees? Well, if you go through the trees, you're in another sort of bare landscape, and 10 kilometres further over is another line of trees. And that gets me going on the business of infinity. Is time infinite? Is space infinite? Is my mind just an infinite part of infinitude? Now, I don't think in those words, but I think visually. And the thing that might lead me to write the next book, or in the past when I was writing, might be beyond the third or fourth line of trees, which might take me some time to reach in my mind or reach with my feet.
But when he does finally reach that third, maybe even fourth line of trees, where does that spark of an idea come from? How does he discern whether something is worthy of his time? An answer to this came to Gerald when he was preparing a paper, The Breathing Author, to read at a conference held at the University of Newcastle back in 2001.
I kept several times using this expression, the image that winks at me. And it had only come to me a few days before, sitting in the hotel room with my wife preparing this speech. I thought, how do certain things tell me that I should write about them, whereas certain other things, seemingly more important things, they don't make no appeal to me. And the only way I could think of it was they have a way of winking. And it's not literally a human wink, it's a kind of the sort of way that the roof of a house in the very far distance will wink at you when the sun catches it as you're driving on a distant road. And so these images that wink at me, if I wink at somebody, or I don't, but in the old days when people winked at each other, it was to signify that a bit of shared knowledge. You and I know better than that, don't we? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. So when these things wink at me, they're saying, Gerald, I know something that you ought to know, or we really share something that we ought to talk over and elaborate on. And it's that feeling that this utterly ordinary-looking image has something to tell. Well, what it has to tell is that, I've come to understand this after years of experiencing it, it's connected with another image, which I didn't know it was connected with beforehand. And then when you get to that image and write about it, or when I get to write about it, I find that 3 other images are appearing in the further background, and they're all connected too. Hey presto, I've got a book of fiction.
When we return, Gerald reveals the obsession that's fueled him for nearly 80 years. We'll be right back.
This is a book I felt that I needed to write, that I was a bit scared to write, that I anguished over, but that I felt that I had an obligation to write.
Juice, Tim Winton's epic novel, is out now.
Many of the profiles of Gerald Murnane focus on the idea of his eccentricity. And, to be fair, his list of idiosyncrasies is long and varied. During a 2001 speech that has become somewhat infamous amongst his devoted groupies, he made an attempt to itemise some of them. I have never worn sunglasses. I've never learned to swim. I've never voluntarily immersed myself in any sea or stream. I've never touched any button or switch or working part of any computer or fax machine or mobile telephone. I've never learned to operate any sort of camera. In 1979, I taught myself to type using the index finger of my right hand alone. Since then, I've composed all my fiction and other writing using the finger just mentioned and one or another of my 3 manual typewriters. It's a fabulous list and well worth reading that essay. Gerald Murnane is, it's fair to say, singular. So it won't come as much of a surprise that the account in Tamarisk Row of a little boy playing imagined horse races with marbles on a mat provides an insight into a key passion of Gerald's, a lifelong obsession and an underpinning philosophy for his life. Talk to me about imagined racehorses.
Well, we moved to Bendigo in January 1944, and the third house we lived in two places for a few months each. Then we settled into this little shabby weatherboard place. It's still there, if anyone's listening, number 5 Neil Street. It was number 244 when we lived in it, but it's number 5 now, just off McIver Highway. Then I heard horse races broadcast from Melbourne while my father listened. And then I'd go out in the backyard and I'd repeat some of the names of the horses. And I didn't do this as a parrot might do it. I see now that I did it because I was almost destined to do it, and it fulfilled a deep need in me to have at the far end of my vision, and Melbourne was about as far away as I could imagine, there was an endless not an endless horse race, an endless series of horse races taking place. Now, we both, my interviewer and I, smiled at each other then, and it is a childlike and the sort of thing that you'd smile at. But 80 years later, I still insist that one of my deepest needs is to be confident that in the background of my mind there is a horse race going on. And I could elaborate a lot on that. What were the names of the jockeys? What was the name of the race course? What were the names of the horses? What colours were the jockeys wearing? What were the odds? How was the race going to end? And this series of questions, it can occur to me at any time of the day. I'll be driving somewhere or walking on the golf course or doing any number of things, and suddenly one of these invisible horse races will take place. Now, when I stopped writing for publication in the mid-90s, I had already devised the beginnings of a collection of pages and notebooks and files which would finally, and it wasn't the first time in my life I tried this, I tried it at the ages of 15 and 16. I tried to draw the race courses and name the horses that were performing invisibly at the outskirts of my mind. And I first concealed it from people. The first person I told was my wife. I said, look, I've got this archive starting up with just fictitious horses. No one knows where they are. Well, they're sort of half like Australia and half like New Zealand. She said, where did you find the time? She didn't say, you stupid man, or how silly, or how childish. She said, where did you find the time? She said, you brought up 3 kids, you worked at 2 jobs, you wrote one job being the writing job. Where did you find the time? And I don't know where I found the time. But the archive has grown. It's potentially infinite, as most such things are. And it gives me enormous satisfaction to know that I've documented some of these far-reaching or distant entities. So it's something that developed in me from an early age, and I thought it was something I ought to keep quiet about, but I never thought it was anything symptomatic of some fault in me or failing in me. It's the most difficult thing to explain. And one thing that's kept me balanced and secure about this, when I reflect on this, an American poet who went a bit funny in his old age, and his name was Robert Bly. When I was a teacher of writing, I was always looking for little maxims and little pieces of guidance that I could pass on to my students, because I didn't want to be telling them my views all the time. And I searched through the Paris interviews and books and things. And Robert Bly, I found once, made this, to me, amazing statement. A writer should always, and he used the pronoun his, a writer should always trust his obsessions. And thank goodness for me, I trusted my obsessions, my horse racing obsessions, my landscape obsessions, my daydreams about the Western District and the plains and so on. And the books were one result of my trust.
I'm glad you say that, because one of the things that I have long admired and enjoyed in the way you talk about writing and the life of the mind is that you use the word obsessions a lot. Obsessions and passions you talk about quite comfortably. And I think so much of Australian, particularly Australian masculine culture, is this kind of laconic, oh, I don't want to show my hand, I can't go too big, or I can't be obsessive or passionate, or and I like that you don't have any inhibition about that. You obsess, you're passionate.
We've mentioned my wife a few times. I used to think, when she described her childhood to me, it was a childhood just lost in books. She read all the Mary Grant Bruce books, she read all of Henry Lawson's collected works. And at first I used to feel regretful because I had no opportunity to read any of those books and never have. But now I realise I was perhaps lucky not to, because it might have persuaded me that the only way to be a writer was to be a Henry Lawson or a Mary Grant Bruce, whereas I was just locked away with hardly any books to read until I joined libraries, only my glass marbles and the games in the backyard with my brothers, making mud roads and building imaginary farmhouses, putting little twig people in the farmhouses. That was my substitution for reading, and I think I'm lucky. It's a pity that I didn't get that background in one way, but I don't think it's harmed me in any way. I think I was lucky in the end. It happened as it did.
Right through your writing, what role does your awareness of a reader have when you write? Do they exist for you or not until afterwards?
I've said a fair bit about this in, I gave the title Last Letter to a Reader, and the phrase a reader should not be taken to mean any reader. It really should be taken to read one particular reader. And I've only perfected or refined this idea in recent years. The ideal reader, and it's a she because I'm a male, she's almost invisible. Her presence is very real, but her appearance is very hard to discern. And my ideal reader, I've only discovered in recent years, is of supreme importance to me. And I get a sense of justification for having thought about her all these years. Every now and then when somebody in Duluth, Minnesota, or Cape Town, South Africa, will write to me, it needn't be a woman, and I'll just say, look, I've been reading your books for 15 years, and if I lost all my other books and I kept hold of yours, that would be all I'd want to keep hold of. And this only happens once every year or so, and I'm not making this up for sentimental reasons or striking a pose. It is an enormous reward for all the effort that I put into it. And there were years when I wondered whether these people existed, and they turned out to be, they didn't, they only existed in potentiality in those days. Then I wrote the books, then they read the books, and they proved to have existed after all.
How do you feel about your previous books? Do you return to them, and do you return to them with pride, with regret? Are they a snapshot of a moment in time, or are they still a fundamental part of you? This
is an interesting question. I had to go to Ballarat in 2017 for a long course of radiation, once a day, every weekday, and I had to live in a facility provided by the hospital, a very pleasant block of flats, and I had one to myself, and I was to spend a lot of time there, and I thought, what am I going to do? So I was going to reread all my books, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. And I thought, that's because I was worried about the treatment and the cancer and stuff. But I tried again in the COVID years to read them. I can read them in parts. I have reread Tamarisk Row, and then I got into a second book. I thought, no, I can't do this. It wasn't revolting or hurtful. It actually made me feel tired. Not tired of just remembering the huge amount of work that went into them, because that's something that they look finished and polished, and most of them only look that way because they went through an enormous amount of rewriting and repolishing. The later books I got smarter, and I could write sometimes in one or two drafts. There's another feeling I've had, it's a multiple thing. The other feeling I've had was that I could have done it better or differently. There are sentences, now I'm not ashamed to write long, complicated sentences, but I do feel that I've made some very hard demands on the readers of Tamarisk Row. There are some passages that I I could almost feel my hand sort of reaching for a pen or get the typewriter over and rewrite them, just to break them up a little. They're all grammatical sentences, they all make sense, but they almost need to be sort of set out on cards, flashcards, and put around the table to put them back where they naturally belong. There's a few books, and I can't think of an example of this, but I've had the feeling where I felt that I could have said more, revealed more perhaps about, gone more deeply into something. I hesitated because in my earlier years I thought, no one writes like that. But of course, when you think that thought, you really should write that, because that's what you were meant to write, not the way other people wrote. So there's a few various reactions. There are some, of course, there are moments that you sort of, you revel in, where you think, did I really write that? Like, it's almost too profound and too marvellous for me to have written. There's a sentence on early in A Million Windows. It's mentioned in the essay on A Million Windows. I remember the day I wrote it at the desk, all in one draft, and after I'd written it, I wrote in pencil beside it, "This may be the best sentence I've ever written." And over in Adelaide, a few years later when the book was published, a man called Shannon Burns penciled beside the same sentence, "This may be the best sentence I've ever read." So this is an extraordinary occurrence. And he told me about it, and I said, "I think I know the sentence you mean." And I took him he was in my room, I took him to the sentence. So you get these moments as well. Look, I'm one of the lucky ones. If there's any guiding light through this mad jungle of publication and writing and thought and ambition, it's that you don't imitate. To think that of all the things I could have written about in the late 60s, the Vietnam War, the rising of the feminists, Germaine Greer and stuff, what did I start at? A boy in a shabby little weatherboard house pushing glass marbles around a mat.
Yeah.
I think that's a good ending for it. Now, where do you go now? Dunkeld?
I am going to drive to Dunkeld now.
I might even suggest your machinery, your electronic equipment will probably tell you the right thing.
I think it'll give me a steer. Thank you so much for making the time for me today.
Nice to meet you.
Really good to meet you.
If we don't meet again, we're one of those circle of people who have kind feelings towards each other and wish each other well.
Quite right too. I feel the same. Thanks heaps, Gerald.
You can find all of Gerald Murnane's books at your favourite independent bookstore. We'll also put a couple of links to essays about him and his work up on the Read This website. The Murnane Industrial Complex is helpful in making sense of his work and his mind. And if you're just starting out, I recommend The Plains as a taste of his fiction and Something for the Pain for a bit of memoir. Good luck. Before we go, just to mention that this episode marks the 1-year anniversary for Read This. Back in July of last year, we shared with you a visit to Helen Garner's house, and now, a whole year later, it's a trip to the Goroke golf course. What a treat it's been, an utter privilege to share these conversations with you week in, week out. A huge thank you to you, our listeners, and the support we've had from publishers, booksellers, and readers alike. And a special thanks to the now more than 50 writers who have given their time, their generosity, and the stories behind the books we love. Couldn't be prouder of what we've made. Go and trawl through the archive for any episodes you might have missed and buy the writers' books at your local independent bookshop. And rate, review us, share links to your favourite episodes, even start a book club about what you've read. Next week on the show, I'm joined by writer Dylan Hardcastle to discuss their new novel, A Language of Limbs, which was inspired by their late great-uncle Douglas, who had one of the most moving and affirming responses to Dylan coming out.
My darling, it is an honour and a privilege to love and to witness you. And then he broke into song and he sang the entirety of You Are So Beautiful to Me. Is that the name of the actual song?
Honestly, it's immediately recognisable from that refrain.
Yeah, 95 at the time, sings the start to finish, and then he says at the end, and anyway, I've always known.
Read This is produced and edited by Clara Ames, with mixing and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.